Hello and welcome to episode 11 of Subplot of Course, a podcast discussing a new science fiction literary work on the second Tuesday of every month by casual fans just like you. I'm Stavros, and with me is someone whose love of wormholes is surpassed only by his love of putting up with unmotivated students, Charlie. Say hi, Charlie.
I'm not sure about that order, but okay.
Oh, great. Also with me is Vincent, who is investigating the epidemic of belief in extraterrestrial life amongst unpopular podcasters. Say hi, Vincent.
It's a serious problem. All four of us, we're infected.
All right, and finally we're also joined by John, a man who definitely knows what machine components are for before he starts working on them. Say hi, John.
Hey there, podcast listeners. I know what's what.
All right, today we're going to be talking about Contact, written by Carl Sagan and published in 1985. And of course, you should be prepared for spoilers. All right, going over the plot of this novel. Scientist Ellie Arroway, a lifelong religious skeptic, runs an array of radio telescopes engaged in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. One day, a strong radio signal is detected from the star Vega, which begins as a series of prime numbers, but is eventually revealed to be the plans to build a capital M machine. After having to deal with the influential religious figures that are skeptical of the scientists, an association of all the world governments agreed to build the machine even though they have no idea what it does. When it's activated, Arroway and four others are whooshed off to the center of the galaxy where they briefly meet the extraterrestrials. But unfortunately, upon returning to Earth, Arroway finds that all evidence of the journey has been destroyed and that the world governments think they were conned into building the machine and proceed to publicly say that the machine's activation was a failure. The novel concludes with Arroway attempting to find evidence she needs to go public about her alien encounter. Very dramatic stuff. So jumping right into some of the topics here. So, I just went through the plot, and that ending, man, it quite a bit of a dissonance compared to the rest of the book's more optimistic message. It's basically, Arroway herself is kind of a religious skeptic and kind of goes to town on. There's a lot of religion versus scientist stuff in this book, and right at the end, she kind of just gets stuck with her own skepticism. So, how did you guys feel about this? It's kind of like a huge change in tone right at the end of the novel.
No, I thought it was. I thought the ending was kind of expressing. Real early on, they're talking about the sense of wonder of the universe and that sort of thing, and they kind of introduce the idea that is the core of science, is the being in awe of the organization and all these different things. Like, I remember reading an article way back when that, if you look up Isaac Newton, he's kind of an alchemist crackpot. Like, he spent a large part of his life trying to find secret codes in the Bible and stuff like that. But it makes sense that someone with that kind of just crazy looking for patterns or something would invent physics and come up with mechanics that have no justification, and fields wouldn't be discovered for centuries, but he came up with gravity at a distance, attractions to masses, and all that stuff. So kind of linking back to that idea that science itself is almost based on a mystic belief and kind of connecting it all back together at the end.
Yeah, interesting. I had this as a separate topic, but the religion versus skepticism feels like a very core concept for this book. So, and you're basically saying science comes from crazy.
That's a little harsh, Stavros. There is this kind of irrational belief that the universe has to be rational.
Why can't it be both? That's what I say.
Interesting. Yeah, I was about to say, Charlie, you almost made it sound like, scientific mysticism was sort of the end goal of the book was to describe the parallel between the two. I actually thought it was different. I thought they were trying, I thought, I'm going to call him Carl. Carl was basically trying to, my buddy Carl and I, we get each other. So I kind of thought he was talking about how, in the very end, the scientific, I don't want to say belief, but scientists have to be skeptics in the end. They're not looking for proof, they're looking for evidence.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what they bring up is the core difference between religion and sciences. And I think that's why one of the final conversations is the one she has with the preacher is because she's like, I have this thing that like I need to go find the proof for and lay out and everything like that. And the preacher guy's like almost nodding because that's kind of what his entire life has been in a sense. It's not the same, and I don't think the book is suggesting they're the same, but it's kind of suggesting a parallelism.
Yeah, I mean, for me, so there's this big scene in the novel where it's Arroway and like the presidential science advisor versus the religious guys, and they're having this big old like religion versus science debate. And personally, I kind of feel, from my personal perspective, I feel a lot like Arroway. I'm kind of a agnostic perspective. So for me, I'm kind of like more on the side of Arroway there. But during that whole discussion, like I personally, I feel like there's no reason why you can't have both of these things. You can have these signals from space, being they could totally be a message from God. Like why can they not be like? Why can you not find God in the crazy radio signals from space? So why not both?
I think Carl Sagan would agree with you, Stavros, which is the part of the reason why the book ends with all the extraterrestrials all like chasing down like even more complicated signals from a departed kind of predecessor kind of race. And I feel that like science is like a field of study which is populated by people who are kind of skeptical, right? All scientists start out with it's not true until you prove it's true. But the problem with science, I think that he's kind of finding, the reason why the book ends in such a pessimistic note is that, funnily enough, there are almost more skeptics of science than there are skeptics in science. You know what I mean? It's like, to this day, people will be like, oh no, the flu vaccine's bad for you. Hey, don't drink water that's been boiled twice, or blah, 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 blah. Like, or fluorine in the water is also really bad for you. Like, the Earth, kind of in that Sagan kind of portrays in this book, is that, nobody's really willing to take that leap and really accept the science completely. Like, oh, I don't care that we founded like hundreds of new industries. There's all these scientific processes which we can't explain, we don't understand, which work perfectly. But hey, when we don't get the answer we want in the end, you guys made it all up. Even though there's no way that you could have made up all this technology, we're going to claim that you made it all up. We're not going to believe a single cent of it, and we're just going to say that you guys are crazy. So don't tell anybody about what you saw. It's a very weird kind of ending to the book, but at the same time, it kind of portrays the realism that I kind of see in today's world, which is that if science doesn't tell you the answer you want to see, or something bad happens along the way, you're going to blame it on science, and you're going to hide the results. If you'd rather hide the results and go to a comfortable idea as opposed to accept science until many, many years later.
Yeah, fair enough. And so honestly, getting towards the end where conveniently her film doesn't develop, of her alien journey and stuff like that, I kind of felt like I feel like a lot of this book is very. It felt very realistic how they react to stuff, and we'll get to more of that later. But going all the way up until like they conveniently have no evidence, I felt like that just smashed my my immersion. I was like, oh god, he's doing the like ruin the scientist time, and to that discussion, or the guy from the government is just ripping her apart. Part of me, like I said, I was sympathizing with a lot of how the novel is going, and then the same feeling she has, where just like your stomach suddenly knots, or you feel that sudden panic. Like I was starting to feel that too, but at the same time, I'm just like, Carl, I know you're our buddy, but you're being a real dick right now. You're kind of manufacturing this convenient lack of evidence to make me feel this way.
Mm-hmm. Like, and that's the thing is, if all these people are, because occasionally they're explaining general relativity stuff and whatnot, but for at the very end for them to be like, oh yeah, let's ignore all the consequences of how wormholes basically also are time travel, so that we can disbelieve everything that happens at the end, is kind of annoying and short-sighted. But on the other hand, if someone told you, we're scientists, we're smarter than you, this couldn't happen, and then the thing that couldn't happen happens, and they just have another science explanation, I can understand and be like, shut up, you just shut up.
We don't take kindly to use science types around here.
But isn't that kind of the basis of like theoretical physics? Is here, this is the way it works, and then it's like, oh shoot, that's not how it works. We got this new evidence. Here, I got something else. Don't worry, I can explain that.
No, that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where it's like the book has a lot of stuff about almost like the nature of science and scientific research and stuff like that.
Scientific conclusions can be temporary.
Yeah. And, well, yes. Like, the sad thing I always tell my students, because I remember in high school, they taught us, like, d-orbital hybridization was a thing, and then later on, one of my students said, oh, yeah, like, there was an article in the AP test saying that that's no longer a thing, so it's no longer tested. And I was just like, what? So I tell my students, like, one thing that is listed as fact that you know for sure from science probably, but at very least, isn't the entire truth. And on the other hand, there's probably at least one thing that's just entirely wrong that we have misunderstood and just kind of works for now.
And the thing is, Airways talks about that, and literally exactly that. Like, everything we know is right until we figure out something else, like another piece of evidence, and then it becomes wrong.
And that's the thing. I think it's like, that's what I was talking about earlier, is it's kind of the nature of scientific knowledge and how a lot of it's a lot closer to what people consider all these other irrational belief systems than you would like to believe. I think it's real nice and subtle about getting to that point, and it doesn't shove it down your throat, because then other people are like, then why believe anything, man? Like, that's not what it's saying.
All right, so let's switch gears and talk a little bit about how the world reacts to receiving the capital M message to build the capital M machine. So personally, when I was reading this book, as I kind of mentioned already, I thought this, of course it takes place during the Cold War, so there are certain things like the Soviets are still around and stuff like that, but I kind of felt like it was actually fairly
It takes place in the 90s, and the Soviets are still around.
That is true. But despite all that, I felt like I was like, wow, like something about receiving information about an alien intelligence, like and the world coming together to do something about it. It seemed like very believable to me. I don't know if that's just because
you're a Trekkie. It's because you're a Trekkie.
I know. I was gonna bring that up. It's like that's literally what happens in Star Trek. Of course we blow each other up, but then it's like, oh, they're aliens.
It's like already post-apocalyptic world, and it's just the remnants of humanity meet up with aliens, and they're just like, well, there's like 6 of us, so we might as well be cool about
it. So maybe that's it. But what did you guys think about it? I mean, it's to me, it's a very like positive world cooperation type message.
So maybe a little too positive. Not too positive as in I don't want that. Too positive as in the expectation. This was written sort of after the fall of the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union falls.
It took place after the fall of the Soviet Union, but it was written before.
Yeah,
so that's the thing where I make the joke that it's like Forever War, where it's like the far future, the 1990s, except instead of robot suits with finger lasers, you have USSR that lasted to the end of the millennium and a female president.
But there was a tremendous amount of like cooperation essentially expected from the Soviets. Essentially, in the 1990s, we were going to be on good terms. We were going to cooperate on this giant scientific endeavor. Of course, the assumption was that their ability to produce items would be pretty poor. In the end, they weren't even able to produce the machine.
That's the saddest thing, where it's like, the Soviets, they tried.
They did their best.
But the Japanese were totally cool and still had a robust economy.
Yeah.
It was very hopeful. It was exceedingly hopeful.
So to me, it's like, wow, the Japanese do a good job and the Russians do a poor job. That seems pretty believable to me.
No, the Americans did a good job. We just couldn't keep it safe. That's all.
Yeah, but I mean, even despite the fact that there are these like outlying, religious fanaticism type stuff and devil cults and whatever, which I found that pretty believable too. But also like everyone coming together to do the thing also was both awesome and pretty good. I liked it. It's believable.
I find it exceedingly unlikely that at least given current situations, I think it'd be exceedingly unlikely that we would cooperate, just because of the technological and military value of the technology, but also because they explained in the book there's contrasting views about whether or not the message is even safe to work on or that it's good.
Yeah, and that's part of the thing. It's like we just don't friggin' know what it means and what the machine does, but and yet people come together anyway. And I thought that was, I loved it.
Especially the part where they're like, we put the things together, and then this like weird organic material built a machine. Like at that point, I would have been like, no.
What do you think, Vincent?
I think that like Carl Sagan sets at least a good premise for why they have to cooperate at least once, which is the whole fact that the radio signal is kind of broken up as Earth spins. It's not pointing at Vega all the time, so sometimes your country's on the opposite side of Vega, so you don't get the message. It's broken up. And then he was also saying, well, there's definitely not enough cooperation. Everyone would get really antsy if the United States or Russia send up a satellite into space to get the answer just for themselves, and other people shoot it out of the sky. So I'm like, okay, that sounds like the Earth I live on. But at the same time, a fractured message does mean that, oh yeah, the scientific community does have to cooperate, at least to a certain extent. So I was like on board for that part.
Yeah, the one thing I was wondering is like how much of this is, and this is where I felt like I could research, like how much of the idea of the world coming together is already kind of built on Carl Sagan's like own experience where, yeah, like the USSR and the USA are at odds, but for some reason, like the scientists can come together in these endeavors for like broader projects.
The
like,
power of science.
The uniting power of science.
All right, so, and springboarding off of this, and I'm going to go there, and I'm so sorry for our handful of listeners, but I'm not sure. As much as I felt that the coming together reaction was good, I'm not sure what would have happened if, given the current political climate and powers that be in this country, if this would have gone the same way, if this administration was in power.
So let's just state this in case people listen to this like 40 years from now. Our current president is President Trump.
Yeah.
And the USSR does not exist anymore.
Russia still wants to kill us, though, probably.
Putin is in power in Russia.
Whatever story Trump wants told, he's going to have told regardless of reality. Like, if he wanted people to find out about what happened in the machine, he'd just declassify it and be like, no, okay. I think that's the whole point of having it be like the radio dishes and having to do it from all over the world, is because it kind of forces cooperation to the point of saying it's just going to be us is unfeasible.
I mean, that's kind of true. So I kind of agree, and I also think that Carl tried to show us that. I mean, he did go through scenarios, and he introduced government characters, who were highly skeptical about cooperation and truly thought through what the geopolitical ramifications would be.
There's a whole couple chapters in the center of the governments of the world arguing like whether even doing this machine or even having listened to the message was a good idea.
That's right. I mean, the other concept is that although yes, there's this concept that the world is turning, and therefore our satellites would only be able to get some of the message. We get gaps. And therefore, in order to get the entire message, it might take a considerable longer period of time. That being said, like in the global order, I'm going to go on a limb here, and I would say that we probably have more ground listening stations that could receive such a message than probably any other country in the world, at least as portrayed in the book. So, humanity might be at a disadvantage and it might take longer, but the U.S. would certainly get it long before anybody else would.
I don't know if technology-wise that's true, but it's just from like a geography-wise.
That's true. Yeah.
Even if you're missing 1% of the message, though, like you could have like 99% of the world covered, but if you miss 1% of the message, all it takes is one Russian spy to insert like 5 lines of wrong code, and your machine just blows up, and you waste $3 trillion.
Yeah.
It's really not really worth it to be like, oh, I'm going to be secret. I'm going to get the message all myself, because you just never know how to verify what's true and what's not.
I was going to say the two things that are probably unreasonable politically in the book is putting together $2 trillion to build a machine that we have no idea how it works. Like, I understand the researching the parts and figuring them out. Like, I'm very surprised there's much less of, we figured this out and we weaponized it. But the other thing is
that's Contact 2.
The other thing is, we finally put this machine together, and I'm very skeptical of, like, everyone agrees we should send the scientists of the world. I'm like, no. You're going to send the token scientist guy, and I don't know, probably token army guy. It'd probably be a much broader array of like skill sets. Because I figured at the end, that's the one thing I found most ridiculous, where it's like, you guys just nominated a bunch of scientists so you could do this stupid hoax and blah blah blah, and I'm just like, you guys agreed to it, and I feel like the governments of the world would insist that someone more like political based of some sort, like a little more savvy in some way other than science,
Yeah, but it would have been a total waste. It's like, oh, we sent guys. It's like, politically, what's your government system? Like, can we establish trade treaties? No. One way.
We are here only for science.
It's like, damn, it's like, the scientists got there, like, oh, explain to me the portals. Like, okay, sure. Explain to me this. It's like, oh, yeah, it's great. What are the hidden numbers? Pi, blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh, this is great. But, like, if you send a politician or a religious person, I guess the religious person might have come back and been like, if you sent the really angry religious guy, the Rankin guy, right, then he might have come back and been like, but he probably wouldn't have gotten the machine in the first place. He was like, it's a gateway to hell,
No, but there'd just be more. I know the idea is it's like math is the language that everyone should discover in the universe and that sort of thing. But I feel like governments would not allow it to just be like purely like math science guys being sent out.
So let's actually switch gears a little bit, and we touched a little bit about the $2 trillion machine or whatever it costs, and we happen to have someone who works on things like this in this podcast right now. I don't know if they're worth $2 trillion. Probably not. But
no,
you're much closer than the rest of us.
And he's been to Alpha Centauri and back.
Wow.
I've done
a lot of qualifications.
What can I say?
But as a person who literally works on machines,
rockets, he is a rocket scientist. He's the only rocket scientist I know.
Yeah, I have. I mean, I've worked on the space shuttle program. I've worked on large government managed aerospace projects, and I just think it's. I mean, I thought that the way it was depicted in the book was, at least from a management standpoint, wasn't like that far off. This seems like a big government project. We'll get each component, and we'll have subcontractors produce them, and then they'll test them to make sure they're perfect. But then we'll have this other governmental agency test every single component to make sure they're perfect. The fact that it was in Japan was sort of irrelevant, but I just thought that this seems like a project run by the government that would be exceedingly expensive, and to maintain the maximum chance of success. Maybe Carl, because of I don't know. I know he worked at some point for NASA. Obviously, he worked in academia, I think, as well. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's what he was most familiar with. He's like, oh, if we were going to build a $2 trillion machine, then it would be just like the shuttle. It would be very expensive. Holy cow! I don't think
there would be no seatbelts. No seatbelts at all.
No seatbelts.
That for sure wouldn't happen.
Is it? I mean, is it even practical to build stuff straight up from specs and not even know what it's for? I mean, that must increase the cost quite a bit.
They didn't go into like tremendous details. It made it sound like they were schematics. So, gosh, I mean, assuming the schematics were detailed enough, I suppose if they provided enough detail that. So the thing is, he went through some detail about how the machine had to be within our capability to actually construct, right? Sure. So if we could get the message, then is it within our manufacturing capability? Not just the materials, but the specifications. How closely tolerant the items need to be. Could you build it just from schematics? I almost want to say that it would be really hard to do that. It almost seems like it ought to be because you have all the instructions, but. That's not real. That's not how actual systems work. A lot of times we're not quite sure what the behavior would be until we're testing them as subsystems and as full systems.
Yeah, given the atmosphere, you don't know if it's going to burn right or if it's going to burn wrong.
It would be a tremendous leap of faith. Let me put it that way. To say we're going to spend all this money on something that we do not know how it works and we don't know what it will do.
Can you imagine if it blew up the planet? How comical that would have been.
That's Contact 3, Judgment Day.
Well, interestingly, one of the arguments, and I thought it was actually a pretty good one, probably one that, if I was in the same position, I would say the same thing, where it's like, oh, is this thing dangerous? Send us the instructions and we're building a bomb. And, the scientist or the engineer in me is like, no, that's impossible. Unless this thing is, it needs 50 nuclear reactors plugged into it. There just won't be enough power to blow us up.
It's like conservation of energy. That totally makes sense.
That's right. And so it kind of makes sense. But then there was essentially a gotcha, which is that, yes, if you don't provide it with enough power, then in a closed system, conservation of energy, you couldn't generate that kind of response. But in reality, what we ended up doing was creating this portal for them attach a wormhole where something could come through. So it's not really a closed system. It kind of blows up the whole idea of closed systems. Because then they could be like, oh, here's a nuclear bomb right through the wormhole, right at you.
Like it could be you charge it up just enough to access another energy source that blows everything up.
Yes.
All right, we're running short on time, so I'm going to go with final thoughts. But on top of your final thoughts, I want to hear, if you were in charge, if you ran the Earth, would you have built the machine? So final thoughts, I'll go first. I liked a lot of this, the message of this book, at least up until the very end. At the end, I kind of have mixed feelings about it. I feel like, our buddy Carl kind of conveniently tossed reversed the roles of the scientists and skeptics. So I kind of feel like that was kind of like it came out of nowhere. But otherwise, I really like the religion and skepticism. They're not necessarily the same. They can be reversible. I like that message. And if I were in charge, would I build a machine? Yes, I would, because I totally bought into all the optimistic crap that this book talks about. So let's ask around. Charlie, what did you think? Final thoughts.
I like the book. It was good.
Okay. And would you have built a machine?
Probably. I figure we're all gonna die someday, so even if it's a bomb, just don't tell anybody, flick a switch, we're all dead, or it did something cool. Doesn't really make that much of a difference either way. Besides, as we found out later, they could just bombard us with giant space particles, and we would have never known it anyway, so the fact that they didn't do that after discovering us means they're probably not planning on doing that, so yeah.
Okay, fair enough. How about you, John?
I liked the book a lot. I thought that it explored good topics. They talked about building the machine for a long time, and so I loved it. And I love the wormhole stuff. I know I'm not quite as knowledgeable, but I really liked the ending. I love the meeting the aliens and then finding sort of the mystery of the universe and the sort of a higher being or creator in Pi. I just thought it was really clever. Would I have built the machine? I think so. I think that if you believe in spaceflight or exploration at all, then I think you would build the machine. And the counter argument that it's too dangerous. Well, there's then you're horrendously underestimating how dangerous, without the message, how life on Earth is so fragile. Period. So I think in the interest of exploring for humankind, I think it's worth it. Build the machine.
Build it. All right, what do you think, Vincent?
So I have to tell a little bit of a story here. Contact is actually the first science fiction book I ever read. It was the first book I picked up when I was randomly walking along in the high school library too. I picked up Contact, I read it, and it was instantly what turned me into a sci-fi kind of fan. So I have a very, very, very soft spot in my heart for it, even though I didn't remember how it ended when I had to reread it for this podcast. And as I read the book for the second time, I realized why I love that book. I mean, there are a lot of things that I consumed when I was younger that I regret it. I think the first time I ever watched Independence Day, the movie, I was like, this is the best movie ever! And I'm like, and in retrospect, I'm like, okay, that was a good movie. It was campy, but definitely not the best movie. Contact to me is still an amazing book because I think it was a lot really before its time. In and of itself, it has, religion and it has sci-fi and it has the depth of the Forever War with all the time travel stuff. But it brings in a lot of kind of realism to it. It's not just you've got Nigerian physicists, you've got worldwide politics, you've got religion factoring in, terrorists blowing up machines, project almost getting axed. And part of it has plots for hundreds of different movies and books that I've read before, mentioned in passing in various paragraphs. There's one paragraph where they're the lifespans are increased in space. So there was a time when they built a bunch of different habitats in space for rich people, but then they decided that maybe that'd be a bad idea because then the Earth would go to shit because only poor people run the Earth. I'm like, that's a whole movie. People took paragraphs and made into multi-million-dollar movies, and he's just throwing these ideas left and right. I'm just like, wow, this is so cool as I was reading the book, because it's just so deep and there's so many interesting ideas going on. Not to even mention about the cryptography and all the secret messages hidden in numbers, etc., etc. So I have to say that this was an excellent book. I still highly recommend it to anyone who has never read Contact. So final question is, would I build the machine? Yes, I would. And I mean, that's predicated on the fact that you don't have to turn on the machine. Part of me would be like, if I could build a machine, I would build it. And then, when the world is kind of like always on the, like, they always say there's a nuclear doomsday coming along. Like, I always figure on any given day, there's like a non-zero probability that someone hits a nuclear button somewhere in the world, right? And given with my luck, if I had to roll a 10,000 sided dice, I'd eventually hit a 1. And I'd be like, damn it, like, today's a day, everything goes up in smoke. Let me turn on the machine. Let's see what happens, because the nuke's in the air. I've got like 5 hours until it hits San Francisco, because every nuke targets San Francisco. I don't know why, but let's get out and let's save ourselves. If we're gonna die to someone else's nuke, I might as well die to my own machine that I built. Let's hit the button. So yes, I would definitely build a machine. I might not necessarily turn it on right.
That's a beautiful story. You started it by saying that you picked up a book in the library and read it. Are you indicating that you read the entire book standing where you picked it up, like in one? That is not far from the truth, because in high school we had free periods. So during my free period, I'd usually do my homework during recess with you guys sometime. And then I would have kind of free period as a literal free period. So like we'd have to do in the library. So I literally walked down the aisles. I was exploring the library. I'd never been to the very, very back section. I found the sci-fi section. I'm like, sci-fi sounds interesting. That sounds kind of cool. Like science. Like I liked it, science. And I found Contact. It was like, it was like highlighted as an awesome book. I grabbed it. I stood there, and I usually read the jacket cover and I put books back. I actually stood there and I read probably the first 3 or 4 chapters before the bell rang. I said, this one's coming back home with me. And I walked up to the front desk and I checked it out, and then I finished it probably that day, actually, because I used to read books at a very fast clip.
Okay. Well, good. I like that. I like that. We all know you a little bit better now, for better.
Well, you all went to the same school as me, so you sat at the exact same library. You just probably didn't read them.
No, I did not stand in one place and read a book for 3 hours.
I had homeroom in the library.
We had a library?
Wow. All right. With that, I think that's pretty much all the time we have for episode 11. And as usual, if you have feedback or suggestions on books we should read and discuss, you can reach us at subplotofcoursepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter at subplotpodcast.
Send us questions.
Please contact us.
Fan mail. Love letters to Charlie.
What?
Yeah. All right, for next month's episode, we're going to be talking about The Martian by Andy Weir, published originally in 2011. All right, say goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Later.
I said goodbye to you, but in a different timeline. I went through the wormhole.